It begins, as many obsessions do, with a small glass, a delicate vessel, often chilled and filled with a clear, faintly green liquid. Beside it, a silver spoon, intricate, filigreed, resting gently across the rim. Upon that spoon, a single cube of sugar. And then, the ritual, a slow pour of cold water dripping drop by drop, as the green begins to cloud into a milky mist. It's called louching, a transformation both chemical and poetic. And for much of the 19th century, this simple act became a symbol of sophistication, rebellion, and, for some, quiet ruin. You are sitting in a café in Paris, perhaps around 1840. The room hums softly, a blend of cigarette smoke chatter and the faint scrape of chairs on wooden floors. The hour is early evening, when the working day bleeds into leisure, and the green or l'oeil vert begins. Absinthe, a drink once used as medicine, has become the fashionable poison of poets and painters alike. But before the cafés of Montmartre filled with dreamers and absinthe spoons glittered under gaslight, the story of this strange emerald drink began in a place much less romantic, the Swiss countryside, among the Alpine herbs and modest apothecaries of Val di Travers. The apothecary's tonic in the late 18th century, long before it was poured into Parisian glasses, absinthe began as a medicinal tonic. Its key ingredient, Artemisia absinthium, or wormwood, was not new. For centuries, wormwood had been used to treat digestive problems, fevers, and intestinal parasites. The ancient Egyptians recorded it, the Greeks prescribed it. Its bitterness was legendary. Even its name, derived from the Greek absinthion, literally means undrinkable. In Val di Travers, a valley shrouded in mist and isolation, two sisters, the Henriade sisters, began selling a green herbal elixir. It contained wormwood, anise, fennel, and other alpine herbs steeped in alcohol. Locals said it cured everything from stomach cramps to melancholy. It wasn't yet the absinthe of Paris. It was a curative, a bitter medicine, something to be taken by the spoonful. Around the same time, a French doctor named Pierre Ordinaire, exiled in Switzerland after the Revolution, is said to have encountered the potion. Some stories claim he refined it into a more palatable drink. Others say he simply branded what already existed. He allegedly prescribed it to his patients as a panacea, for digestion, for nerves, for the general malaise of life. Whatever the truth, by the early 1800s, the recipe made its way into commercial production. The earliest large-scale producer, Henry Louis Pernod, opened a distillery in Pontellier in 1805. His brand, Pernod Fils, would soon dominate the market and become synonymous with absinthe itself. And from that distillery, nestled near the Swiss border, flowed the green tide that would wash over Europe. A drink of empire. In the beginning, absinthe wasn't for artists. It was for soldiers. The French army, campaigning in North Africa in the 1830s and 1840s, was plagued by poor water and disease. Absinthe, with its high alcohol content and herbal properties, was used to purify water and prevent illness. Officers and legionnaires alike took it daily, diluted of course, but always with a hint of that bitter, aromatic taste. When they returned home, they brought the habit with them. By the mid-19th century, absinthe was no longer a niche tonic. It became a national drink. Soldiers drank it, so civilians followed. In cafés and salons across France, the ritual spread. 5 o'clock was no longer just the end of the day. It was l'heure verte. And across Paris, from the smoky corners of Montparnasse to the bright terraces of the Boulevard Saint-Germain, you could hear the clink of spoons and see the slow bloom of milky green in glass after glass. To drink absinthe was to be modern. It was to be part of a world fascinated by chemistry, invention, and the illusion of control. The 19th century loved rituals that felt scientific, precise, repeatable, transformative. Absinthe gave that illusion. You could measure it, dilute it, observe its change. You could turn something transparent into something clouded, like a thought dissolving into dream. The artist's muse, and then came the artists. They were drawn to absinthe the way moths are drawn to light, with fascination and inevitability. By the 1860s, the cafés of Paris had become their sanctuaries, and absinthe their sacrament. You might find Edouard Manet sketching figures through the haze of his drink at the Café Gerbois, or Lautrec mixing absinthe with cognac, a brutal concoction he called the earthquake. Vincent van Gogh found inspiration and despair in equal measure through its shimmering green promise. Verlaine and Rimbaud, the poets of disorder, wrote of the green fairy as if she were a goddess, one who offered visions and destruction in the same breath. To them, absinthe represented something greater than intoxication. It was rebellion, against bourgeois restraint, against the dullness of sobriety, against the mechanical order of a world fast industrializing. In its bitter perfume and slow ritual, they found a kind of mysticism. The drink blurred boundaries between waking and dream, reason and madness, art and delusion. The café became their temple, the glass their altar. And Paris, restless, luminous Paris, became the capital of the green fairy. A city in green, imagine the streets at dusk, gas lamps flickering in mist. Painters, writers, prostitutes, philosophers, all drifting toward the cafes as the sun dipped behind the sign. Absinthe was not just a drink, it was a color, a mood, a culture. Advertisements painted the walls. Posters of elegant women pouring green liquid into curved glasses, captions whispering promises of creativity, escape, allure. Even the color itself became fashionable. Dresses, wallpapers, ink, all tinted green, all suggesting that same forbidden pleasure. Yet, beneath the ritual and romance, a shadow lingered. Absinthe contained not only wormwood but also thojone, a chemical compound believed at the time to cause hallucinations, madness, and even convulsions. Science now tells us the concentrations were too low to cause such effects, but 19th century fears were less forgiving. Rumors spread of men driven mad, of artists cutting off their ears, of women ruined by its seductive glow. And as its popularity soared, so did its enemies. The growing backlash by the 1880s. Absinthe was no longer the drink of soldiers and artists alone. It had become the drink of everyone, from factory workers to the bourgeois elite. Bars served it by the gallon. Consumption rose so high that by 1910, France was drinking 36 million litres of absinthe a year. Wine producers, whose industry had been devastated by the phylloxera plague in the 1870s, saw absinthe as a threat, an artificial rival to their ancient vineyards. The press began to turn. Moral reformers, physicians, and religious groups launched what came to be known as anti-absinthism. Newspapers published lurid accounts of absinthe-induced madness. One famous case in 1905, the Lanfray murder, sealed its fate. A Swiss farmer named Jean Lanfray, reportedly intoxicated on absinthe, among other drinks, murdered his family. The details were sensationalized, the green drink was blamed entirely, and the event became the rallying cry for prohibitionists. Public sentiment shifted overnight. The green fairy was no longer seen as a muse. She was a demon. The ritual of ruin still. In this early age of mass media, absinthe's image only grew more alluring. The more it was condemned, the more it fascinated. Artists doubled down. Painters depicted absinthe drinkers, pale, hollow-eyed figures sitting alone before their clouded glasses. Degas' painting El Absinthe from 1876 captures it perfectly, two figures lost in isolation, sitting amid the crowd but utterly apart. Their eyes drift somewhere beyond the room, beyond themselves. To drink absinthe became both an act of defiance and despair. You can almost hear the soft drip of water over sugar, the gentle swirl of spoon against glass. A lullaby for a generation dreaming of beauty and dissolution. And yet, for all its supposed madness, absinthe was never merely a drug. It was a mirror, a reflection of a century caught between science and superstition, between progress and decay. The green fairy was both the promise of inspiration and the whisper of oblivion, a drink that blurred the line between creation and destruction. As the century waned and modernity loomed, the glass began to empty, laws tightened, fear spread, and absinthe's shimmering world began to fade into prohibition. But before it vanished entirely, it left behind ghosts, in art, in poetry, in the quiet corners of memory where dreams once turned green. And so, as you sit in that imagined Parisian café, watching the water drip slowly over sugar, you might wonder, was it truly the drink that drove them mad? Or was it the world they were trying so desperately to escape? It is early evening again. L'heure verte, the green hour, sometime in the last decades of the 19th century. The Paris you imagine is one of contrasts, the glow of gas lamps reflected on wet cobblestones, the smell of roasted chestnuts, the clatter of carriages echoing down the boulevards that Baron Haussmann carved through the old medieval city. Inside a crowded café on the Rue Lepic or the Boulevard Clichy, you see the silhouettes of men and women framed in pale light, each with the same object before them, the absinthe glass. In the dim air of tobacco and chatter, a waiter in a starched apron carries a tall carafe of cold water, his motion practiced, almost ceremonial. This is no ordinary drink. It is a ritual of patience, the slow dissolving of sugar into bitterness, a delicate alchemy that requires restraint. And that is what makes it so intoxicating. For in an age of industry, machines and schedules, absinthe demanded time. The artist, the clerk, the poet, they all paused to watch that pale green swirl into opal mist. The green hour was not merely about intoxication. It was a pause in the rhythm of modernity, a moment suspended between work and dream. The café as temple. To understand the allure of absinthe, you must first understand the role of the café in 19th century Paris. It was not simply a place to drink, it was the pulse of the city's intellectual life. Here, writers debated politics, painters sketched each other, and philosophers constructed entire theories over coffee and wine. But as Absinthe took root, the café acquired something else: atmosphere. The dull gold of light through glass, the sharp smell of anise, the faint hum of melancholy that seemed to settle with the drink itself. The cafés of Montmartre and Montparnasse, the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes, the Chat Noir, the Molin de la Galette, became laboratories of art and idleness alike. Absinthe's appeal lay in its subtle contradiction, a stimulant disguised as a sedative. The anise and fennel sharpened the mind, while the alcohol softened it. The result was a state of vivid calm, or so it seemed. Painters found their colors more luminous, poets their words more musical. For a few brief hours, perception itself appeared to expand. The Green Fairy, as she came to be called, whispered inspiration. The poets of decadence, no one wrote more passionately, or more destructively, about Absinthe than the poets of the decadent movement. Chief among them were Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud, whose tumultuous relationship became as legendary as their verse. Verlaine, a man of fragile temperament and deep talent, was already known for his melancholic lyricism. Rimbaud, nearly a decade younger, was a prodigy, brilliant, arrogant, wild. When the two met in 1871, their lives collided in a blaze of poetry and chaos. Absinthe was their shared language. They drank it in dingy rooms and on riverbanks, writing poems that blurred religion with intoxication, love with violence, ecstasy with despair. In Verlaine's letters, Absinthe appears as both muse and monster. He wrote of its beauty, its cruelty, and its strange ability to make the world shimmer just before it fell apart. For him, it was not simply a drink but a theology, a liquid form of temptation. When their relationship ended, violently, with Verlaine's imprisonment after shooting Rimbaud in Brussels, Absinthe remained as a ghost between them. Both would later renounce it in moments of regret, yet neither could fully escape the myth it had given them. Their work, feverish, fragmented, luminous, became the soul of symbolism, and within that movement, the Green Fairy reigned supreme. Painters and the palette of madness. If poets dreamed in words, painters dreamed in color. And Absinthe's green hue, that strange, shifting shade between spring leaf and sea glass, became an obsession. Édouard Manet was among the first to paint its presence, capturing the modern loneliness of the drinker rather than the drink itself. In The Absinthe the Drinkers, 1859, a man slumps against a wall, his glass nearly empty, his eyes distant. There is no glamour, no romance, only the quiet erosion of purpose. Edgar Detached observed Absinthe as a sociological condition. In Absinthe, 1876, two figures sit in silence, their bodies heavy, their gazes unfocused. The woman, modelled by actress Ellen André, stares past a glass into a kind of void. The painting scandalized Paris. Critics called it vulgar, immoral, and indecent. Yet Degas had done what the drink itself did: he stripped away illusion. And then came Vincent van Gogh. For him, Absinthe was not a subject, it was a companion. In the cafés of Arles, he painted tables dotted with the familiar green glasses, their pale glow set against the golden halos of gaslight. His palette seemed to absorb the drink's essence: electric yellows, piercing greens, turbulent blues. He drank it not merely to dull pain, but to court vision. In letters to his brother Theo, he described it as both friend and foe, a spark for creativity that sometimes tipped into delirium. Whether Absinthe truly altered his perception or merely gave name to the storms already inside him remains unknown. But the drink became inseparable from his myth, as much a part of his legacy as his sunflowers and stars. The science of the Green Fairy. By the 1880s, as Absinthe's fame grew, so did scientific curiosity and anxiety about its effects. Chemists began isolating the compound thujone found in wormwood, suspecting it to be a neurotoxin responsible for hallucinations and convulsions. Early studies were crude but alarming. Animals exposed to high concentrations of wormwood oil suffered seizures. The nuance, that absinthe contained far smaller amounts, was often lost in translation. The press eagerly published sensational claims. Doctors warned of absinthism, a new and terrible disease distinct from alcoholism. Its symptoms, they said, included trembling hands, insomnia, seizures, and moral decay. Pamphlets circulated with titles like "The Absinthe the Drinker, a Modern Plague." Illustrations showed respectable men reduced to skeletal wretches, haunted by green phantoms. And yet, for every doctor warning of doom, there was a bohemian defending it as inspiration. The debate grew louder as the drink's popularity soared. Absinthe had become both scapegoat and symbol, the embodiment of modern anxiety. Was the world going mad because of the drink, Or was the drink merely reflecting the madness already there? The shadow of industry behind the art and the poetry. Another story unfolded, one of economics and empire. France's colonial ambitions had introduced absinthe to new markets, while the devastation of the wine industry by the phylloxera louse had left vineyards in ruins. Absinthe filled the gap. Cheap to produce, easy to transport, and potent, it became the beverage of the working class. But when the vineyards recovered, the wine producers sought to reclaim their dominance. They funded anti-absinthe campaigns, publishing pamphlets and sponsoring scientific studies condemning the drink. The Green Fairy became the villain of French moral decline. By the turn of the century, posters once depicting elegant women now showed skeletons pouring poison into glasses. The ritual of the café, once a symbol of Parisian modernity, was recast as decadence. The slow descent yet, even as public opinion turned, absinthe's world carried on. In the cabarets of Montmartre, artists still gathered under the watchful eyes of the Green Fairy. The Chat Noir, with its black cat emblem and dim lamps, remained a sanctuary for dreamers. Songs were written to absinthe, waltzes, ballads, melancholy refrains. In one corner might sit Eric Satie, eccentric and precise, composing sparse piano pieces after his ritual glass. Nearby, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, small in stature but vast in imagination, painted dancers and drinkers in swirls of light and motion. He even invented his own absinthe cocktail, Le Tremblement de Terre, the earthquake, equal parts absinthe and cognac. For these men, the drink was not just a vice, it was a lens through which they saw the absurdity of life. The cafes, smoky and alive, became theatres of humanity, filled with laughter, melancholy, and the dull hum of existence. There was beauty even in the boredom, in the quiet repetition of ritual, the stirring of sugar, the careful drip of water, a small ceremony against the chaos of the world. The dream begins to crack. By 1900, cracks began to show. Reports of crime and madness linked to absinthe multiplied. Whether true or exaggerated, they spread quickly. Families blamed it for poverty, for moral collapse, for everything that modernity had failed to explain. In truth, the absinthe the most workers drank was often adulterated, colored with copper sulfate, flavored with cheap chemicals. The drink of poets had been industrialized, stripped of its mystique, mass-produced in backroom stills. The bitterness that once symbolized sophistication now signified decay. And yet, even as prohibition loomed, artists refused to let the Green Fairy die quietly. Painters still captured her glow, writers still invoked her name. She became a ghostly muse, fading, but never gone. The absinthe glass, empty on a cafe table, came to symbolize the end of an era, a time when art believed it could still transform reality through ritual and imagination. And so, as the clock strikes 6 and the cafes fill once more, you might ask yourself, did absinthe create the age of decadence? Or was it merely the liquid mirror of its inevitable decline? The story of the Green Fairy does not end in the cafes of Montmartre, though it lingers there, in the soft shadows of paintings, in the brittle pages of old poems, and in the faint perfume of anise that memory never quite forgets. By the dawn of the 20th century, absinthe's brilliance had begun to fade. The rituals continued, but the world around them was changing, faster, harder, and less forgiving. Electricity hummed through the city. The horse was giving way to the automobile. The empire was trembling under its own weight, and somewhere between progress and nostalgia, the Green Fairy began her slow descent into myth. The waning of the fairy in the first years of the new century, absinthe was still everywhere. Bars served it by the lighter. Artists and laborers drank from the same bottles, bound by the same slow ritual of sugar and drip. But beneath that familiarity grew a sense of dread. For decades, newspapers had whispered of its dangers. Now they shouted, "Absinthe makes you crazy and criminal?" Read one 1905 headline. "The drink that kills families," claimed another. The event that crystallized this fear, the one that would spell the end, took place in Switzerland, in a quiet rural town. The Lanfray murders. Jean Lanfray was a Swiss laborer, an ordinary man living in the village of Comagny. On the morning of August 28, 1905, he shot and killed his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. When the story broke, it horrified Europe. Lanfray had been drinking heavily, wine, brandy, and, crucially, 2 glasses of absinthe. Though those 2 were a fraction of his total intake, they became the focus of public outrage. The headlines called it the Absinthe murder. Protesters marched demanding a ban. Politicians cited it as proof that the Green Fairy was a national plague. The nuance, that the tragedy owed far more to alcoholism than to wormwood, was lost in the panic. What mattered was the symbol. Within a year, absinthe was banned in Switzerland. The collapse of the Green Empire, the Swiss prohibition, was only the beginning. Across Europe, governments moved to outlaw the drink. The Netherlands banned it in 1910, the United States in 1912, and France, Absinthe's homeland, its beating heart, in 1915. The decision was framed as a moral victory, a triumph of science and order over decay and madness. But there were quieter motivations too. The French wine industry, long threatened by Absinthe's success, had lobbied relentlessly for its downfall. With vineyards restored after the phylloxera blight, wine once again needed to be the drink of France. Distilleries were forced to close. The great house of Pernod Fils, once a symbol of refinement, shuttered its doors. Its copper stills were dismantled, its recipes locked away. The cafés adapted quickly, or pretended to. Absinthe disappeared from menace, replaced by pastis and a nice, flavoured liquor that mimicked the taste but not the controversy. The Green Fairy had been exiled, but her ghost lingered in every glass that turned cloudy under water's touch. A ghost in the glass. The world moved on. Wars came, first one, then another, and absinthe was forgotten, buried beneath the machinery of modernity. In the trenches of the First World War, soldiers no longer drank absinthe, but rationed wine and rough spirits. The 1920s roared without her, the age of jazz and champagne, not sugar spoons and ritual. The drink became a relic, a whispered memory from an older, slower time. Still, in secret, some continued the ritual. In border towns and hidden bars, clandestine distillers produced what they called La Blanche, clear absinthe brewed illegally, traded quietly, consumed carefully. It was no longer a symbol of art or rebellion, it was an act of nostalgia. Writers, especially the expatriates who haunted Paris between the wars, kept the myth alive. Ernest Hemingway, who arrived in the 1920s, was fascinated by absinthe's legend, though by then it was contraband. He wrote of it with reverence in For Whom the Bell Tolls and Death in the Afternoon, describing it as opaque, tongue-numbing, brain-warming. For him, as for many, the Green Fairy had become a metaphor, not for madness, but for something lost, a Europe of dreams, of art, of languid hours before the fall. Science reconsidered. By the mid-20th century, the mythology of absinthe had hardened into dogma. The drink was considered poisonous, hallucinogenic, and corrupting. The very mention of wormwood conjured images of insanity and decay. But slowly, quietly, science began to revisit the question. Chemists re-examined 19th century absinthe recipes and discovered that the concentration of thojone, the supposed culprit, was minuscule, too low to produce hallucinations or toxicity. In truth, absinthe had never been the demon it was made to be. Its effects were those of strong alcohol, perhaps amplified by ritual and suggestion, but not by chemistry. The madness, it seemed, had come from the world, not the glass. The quiet resurrection. By the 1980s, a strange thing began to happen. Collectors and historians, intrigued by absinthe's faded glamour, started researching old distilling methods. In France, Switzerland, and the Czech Republic, experimental producers began to recreate the Green Fairy, guided by 19th century records and long-suppressed recipes. In 1988, a pivotal event occurred. Absinthe was legalized again in Switzerland, quietly, under revised definitions. In France, the ban lingered until 2011, though absinthe, like spirits, had been sold under other names for decades. The revival spread quickly. Bars reopened under names like La Fée Verte and Absinthe the House. Ritual spoons were reproduced, antique fountains polished and displayed once more. The drink returned not as a vice, but as a curiosity, a piece of living history. To sip absinthe in the 21st century is not to court madness but memory. The ritual survives, unchanged. The spoon, the sugar, the slow drip of water turning clear green to cloudy white. A small ceremony against the noise of modern life, echoing a century of silence. The Green Fairy reimagined, and yet, though her dangers were proven false, the Green Fairy never regained her innocence. She remains an emblem of contradiction, beauty and decay, genius and ruin. In museums, Degas absinthe still draws uneasy glances. Van Gogh's name still evokes the image of the mad artist with a green, tinted glass. Poets still quote Verlaine's lament, "I am the empire at the end of the decadence." Absinthe endures not because it intoxicates, but because it haunts. It embodies the longing for a past that feels both luminous and doomed, a time when even destruction seemed poetic. To drink absinthe today is to participate in that illusion, knowingly. The glass becomes a time machine, the ritual a conversation with ghosts. The sugar dissolves slowly, as it did for Van Gogh, for Verlaine, for the soldiers who drank to forget the desert sun. It is a reminder that history is not merely progress. It is ritual repeated, mistakes remade, dreams reimagined. The taste of memory. Those who taste real absinthe today describe its flavor as sharp, herbal, almost medicinal. the bitterness of wormwood balanced by the sweetness of anise. But beyond taste lies something subtler and an atmosphere. Each sip carries the weight of its legend, the flicker of gaslight, the murmur of a forgotten café, the smell of damp streets after rain. It is the taste of an era that refused to be ordinary. Even the tools of its ritual, the pierced spoon, the glass etched with measure lines, the heavy water fountain, are relics of a vanished patience. They remind us of a time when people allowed a drink to unfold slowly, drop by drop, in a world now obsessed with immediacy. To prepare absinthe today is to resist hurry. It is to summon the quiet hum of history, to let something beautiful and bitter coexist in peace. The moral of the fairy: every age has its green fairy, something both worshipped and condemned, a mirror that reveals our anxieties more than our sins. In the 19th century, it was absinthe. In ours, it might be technology, fame, or the endless pursuit of escape. What absinthe teaches, if anything, is that beauty and ruin often share a glass. The artists who drank it sought freedom from convention and found both inspiration and madness. Their tragedy was not in the drink itself, but in their hunger for transcendence, for something beyond the ordinary hum of daily life. And perhaps that is why absinthe endures in memory, because it represents the eternal human wish to dream, even when the dream costs dearly. As you imagine the café fading into darkness, the last sugar cube melting into the milky green, you might wonder, was the green fairy ever truly real? Or was she only the reflection of our own restless desire to see the world turn strange and beautiful for a moment before the morning comes? The Great Wall of China stretches across deserts, mountains and plains, more a scar than a monument. You have seen it in photographs, perhaps winding like a quiet thought through the earth. It is said to be one of the few human-made structures visible from space, though that is a romantic exaggeration. From space, the wall vanishes. From Earth, it dominates. But the true story of the wall lies not in the emperors who dreamed of it, nor in the generals who commanded its defense, but in the calloused hands that placed each stone, tamped each layer of earth, and then vanished from record, forgotten before the mortar dried. In the 3rd century BCE, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, ordered the unification of several existing regional walls. His vision was to bind the country together, and to keep the nomadic tribes of the north, especially the Xiongnu, at bay. He commanded that hundreds of thousands of laborers, convicts, and soldiers leave their homes and take up shovels, picks, and baskets. They were told they were building eternity. What they built was dust. The wall, in its earliest form, was not the solid grey stone we picture today. It was mostly packed earth, hanged-to, rammed earth, layers of soil and straw pounded by heavy wooden mallets. The sound must have been relentless, the dull, rhythmic thud of men beating the ground into submission. They used whatever materials the landscape offered: gravel, reeds, even crushed bones. When it rained, the mixture turned to mud. When the sun returned, it hardened like pottery. And so, day after day, the wall crawled across the mountains, not in grandeur, but in exhaustion. You might imagine, for a moment, standing among them. A conscript from the distant south, marched hundreds of miles from your rice fields to a cold, foreign desert. The wind stings your face, the air dry and thin. You work under the eyes of overseers who measure progress by the cubit and the whip. Every evening, you eat from a small clay bowl millet gruel, sometimes flavored with a pinch of salt if fortune smiles. Salt, in that world, is more valuable than silver. It keeps your body alive under the glare of the northern sun. It also corrodes your hands, cracking the skin that holds your shovel. Salt was rationed, just like food, labor, and sleep. Every few days, a cart would arrive from the nearest depot, carrying sacks of coarse, mineral-rich crystals mined from distant marshes. These deliveries were noted in ledgers by scribes who sat in shaded tents, their fingers stained with ink. The workers who unloaded the salt were rarely literate enough to know what they carried. The empire's invisible blood. For every wall, every brick, every march, there had to be salt, and it was counted as carefully as human lives. The work itself followed a simple rhythm. 2 men would carry baskets of earth up the slope, their shoulders bound by a bamboo pole. A third would spread the earth along the growing line, while another pounded it flat. Overseers marked progress by section, measuring each rise and trench. The wall was built in segments, like the bones of a giant serpent, later connected with mortar and stone. To outsiders it seemed eternal. To those who built it, it was endless. The days were long and undifferentiated. Men woke before sunrise, ate, labored, and slept in the same filth. In winter, frost gathered on their blankets. In summer, their sweat turned to mud. Disease was common: scurvy, dysentery, fever. The dead were buried near the work site, often within the wall itself. Each stone holds a life, a later proverb said, and every life a stone. Archaeologists have indeed found bones mixed with layers of rammed earth. Whether out of reverence or convenience, the dead became part of the wall they built, but not all of the laborers were conscripts. Some were soldiers sent to the frontier as punishment for minor offenses. Others were criminals, spared execution in exchange for a lifetime of servitude. Their chains were often melted down to make tools. They were told this was mercy. Each work camp was its own small world, an ecosystem of cooks, guards, medics, and scribes. The scribes, though few in number, were essential. They documented every ration, every death, every delivery of stone or salt. Their handwriting, careful and deliberate, was a form of state control. To the emperor, the wall was a number the length completed, the men deployed, the supplies consumed. The human cost was a column of figures. Sometimes the workers would carve small messages into stones before laying them. Secret notes, names, prayers to forgotten gods. A few have been found in the remains of early wall sections. I miss home. The wind cuts through the bones. This stone will stand longer than I. They wrote these words knowing no one might ever read them, but perhaps that was enough, a gesture toward being remembered, however faintly. Qin Shi Huang's architects did not imagine that the wall would outlast dynasties. They were building for an empire that believed itself eternal. When the Qin collapsed in 26 BCE, the wall was abandoned in places, reclaimed by sand and grass. Later dynasties, like the Han and the Ming, would rebuild it again and again, layer over layer, each generation believing they were restoring something ancient, when in truth, they were burying the past beneath new foundations. In the Han period, during the 2nd century BCE, the wall became more than a barrier. It became a lifeline for the Silk Road, a string of fortresses protecting the caravans that carried silk, jade, and spices westward. Watchtowers rose along the wall's spine, connected by smoke signals, a primitive but efficient communication system. It is said a warning could travel 500 miles in a day, leaping from one tower to the next. But the men who lit those fires lived lives of silence and vigilance. They waited for months without a signal, staring into the empty horizon. The wall's builders, too, became part of its silence. When work ceased, and the wind swept across the plains, the sound it carried was said to echo like voices. The murmurs of the dead laborers. Locals called them the ghosts of the wall. They whispered at night, it was said, asking for water, for home, for rest. The story endured for centuries because it was true in spirit, if not in fact. The wall is not only a monument of defense, but also of human exhaustion, of ambition beyond mercy. In the heart of the empire, far from the frontier, the officials celebrated each new section's completion with ritual offerings. They burned incense, recited prayers, and inscribed the emperor's name on wooden tablets. None of these ceremonies mentioned the men who had died. In the philosophy of the Qin, the collective mattered more than the individual. The wall was the body of the empire, and each man who built it was merely a cell. Yet, even in that rigid order, small acts of humanity persisted. Workers shared stories, songs, and sometimes fragments of poetry. One early ballad, preserved centuries later, tells of a soldier sent north who never returned. He left with the dawn, carrying a basket of earth. The wall swallowed him whole, and his wife dreams of stone. It is difficult to know whether such verses were sung or imagined long after the fact, but they capture the truth behind the myth. The Great Wall was not built by heroes, but by ordinary men bound by duty, hunger, and the faint hope of survival. Even after millennia, the wall's earliest sections still bear marks of their construction. The thin layers of soil, straw, and crushed reeds, the fingerprints of those who pressed them into place. They are faint now, smoothed by time, but they remain. The fingerprints of nameless men preserved in dust. The wall was meant to protect the empire from barbarians, yet it consumed more Chinese lives than any enemy raid. In this sense, it defended China from itself, a mirror of its ambition and fear. The northern wind still howls across the ridges, brushing the ancient earth as it once brushed the backs of laborers bent beneath their loads. The first section of the Great Wall, they say, began with a command, "Let the mountains be joined." The last sound was the silence of those who obeyed, and so the wall rose, not in triumph, but in fatigue, stone by stone, life by life. Its builders vanished into its shadow, but their work remained, winding endlessly through time. As the sun set on another day of toil, one could imagine a single worker pausing, resting his hand against the newly packed earth, and asking himself quietly. You might imagine that once the wall was built, the empire could finally rest. that soldiers would stand atop its battlements and gaze proudly over the horizon. But the truth was quieter, colder, and far less glorious. The men stationed along the wall, soldiers, guards, and administrators, lived lives of isolation and monotony, stretched thin across a line of earth and stone that had no true end. To garrison the wall was to live in a world of boundaries. It meant waking before dawn to patrol a barren ridge, counting the clouds and the shadows of vultures. It meant weeks without news from home, months without fresh vegetables, years without the sound of anything but wind. The soldiers who guarded the frontier were the forgotten veins of the empire, pumping discipline and silence through its vast and brittle body. After the early builders, during the Han Dynasty, the wall evolved into a living system. Watchtowers stood every few kilometers, linked by fortified passes and small garrisons known as tuns. Each tun might house between 100 and 500 men, a small village of soldiers and their families, if families were permitted. Often they were not. The empire believed that distance maintained loyalty, and loneliness kept the mind obedient. The soldiers lived on rations of millet, dried vegetables, and salted meat. Fresh water was hauled from distant wells, carried in clay jars that cracked in the cold. Their uniforms were heavy and coarse, padded with straw for warmth. In winter, frost bit through the seams, and the men slept huddled together for warmth, their breath clouding the air inside narrow barracks of packed earth. Fires were forbidden on many nights to avoid signaling positions to the enemy. The cold was a form of discipline. Still, the bureaucracy of the empire reached even this far. Every fortress had a records office, a small chamber where clerks maintained scrolls detailing the daily routines of the garrison. There were scrolls for attendance, scrolls for weapon maintenance, scrolls for grain and salt distribution, scrolls for each soldier's name and origin. The paper empire extended into the dust. The command structure was rigid. Captains, appointed by the central government, rarely saw the front lines. Under them were lieutenants, who managed daily drills, and then sergeants, who kept track of patrols and punishments. Every infraction, from missing a watch to spilling water from a ration jar, was recorded. Discipline was not only moral, it was mathematical. The soldiers of the wall were trained not for glory but for vigilance. Their daily exercises included archery, spear practice, and wall inspection. Each day they walked the same sections, scanning for cracks, animal burrows, or signs of erosion. Repairing damage was as important as repelling invaders. The wall was a living structure, and like the empire, it required constant attention to remain whole. In the long hours between patrols, men wrote letters. Most could barely read, but they learned enough to scrawl messages onto thin strips of bamboo or silk. Archaeologists have uncovered such notes from Han outposts near Dunhuang and Jiaoguan. One reads simply, "My feet are swollen. The wind is endless. I dream of plum trees." Another, "The moon tonight is round. I think of my wife and of hot water." The empire's power was measured not only in armies or walls, but in the ability to make men endure such distances. From home, from comfort, from meaning, and continue to serve. Communication along the wall relied on fire and smoke. Watchtowers stored bundles of reeds soaked in oil, ready to be lit at the first sign of movement across the steppe. One tower could signal the next, and so on, a chain of fire stretching hundreds of miles. But false alarms were common, sometimes wolves, sometimes merchants, sometimes the wind itself. A single puff of smoke could rouse an entire garrison, sending soldiers scrambling to the battlements, hearts racing in the cold air, only to find nothing but silence. The loneliness of such nights left its mark. Over time, soldiers developed small rituals to keep their spirits anchored. Some carved their names into the wall. Others left offerings, bits of food, wine, or incense, for ancestors or the spirits of the dead. Many believed the wall itself had a soul, a consciousness formed from the countless lives buried within it. They called it the stone dragon, sleeping beneath the soil, guarding them even as they guarded it. Local myths soon grew around these beliefs. Villagers at the foot of the wall told stories of glowing lights moving along the ramparts at night, the ghosts of dead sentries still performing their patrols. Travelers said that if one slept too close to the wall, they would hear whispers carried by the wind, voices asking for relief from duty or for news of home. In a sense, these legends gave comfort to the living. The dead were still on watch, and the wall was never truly empty. In peacetime, the garrisons also served as outposts of trade and diplomacy. Nomadic tribes sometimes approached with herds of sheep or horses, bartering for salt, iron, or silk. There were quiet exchanges, even friendships, formed in these remote places. The empire's orders forbade trade with the Hu, the northern tribes, but commerce always found a way. A handful of jade beads, a strip of silk, or a flask of grain wine could cross borders far more easily than soldiers could. When war did come, as it often did, it was rarely the dramatic clash of armies that storytellers imagined. Raids were swift, chaotic, and bloody. Horsemen appeared from the horizon, looted outposts, burned supplies, and vanished before reinforcements arrived. The wall slowed them, but it could not stop them. Its real power lay not in defense, but in endurance. It absorbed violence, giving the empire time to breathe. Those who survived such attacks often spoke of the silence afterward, a stillness heavier than the wind. The walls, scorched and blackened in places, stood indifferent. New stones replaced the broken ones, new soldiers took the place of the dead, and the ledgers recorded it all in neat columns. Life along the frontier resumed, as it always did. By the Tang dynasty, centuries later, the wall had become less a military structure and more a symbol, a thin line marking where China ended and the steppe began. But the garrisons remained, relics of older wars. Some evolved into towns with markets, temples, and schools. Others were abandoned, left to crumble back into earth. Even so, travelers along the Silk Road would still find traces of them. The faint outlines of walls, shards of pottery, fragments of ink stones. Imagine walking through one such ruin centuries later. The air is dry, the earth pale and cracked. You find a stone with faint characters scratched upon it. A name perhaps, or a date. You brush the dust away, and for a brief moment, you are connected to a man who once stood watch here, his eyes scanning the same empty horizon. For those men, time moved differently. Days were marked not by the calendar but by the rotation of duties. Morning watch, midday patrol, night signal. Seasons blurred into each other. Winter's cold was a constant, summer's heat a brief reprieve. The wall itself seemed to breathe with them, expanding and contracting with the freeze and thaw of the seasons. And yet, despite the monotony, some soldiers grew to love the frontier, the openness, the solitude, the vast sky unmarred by city smoke. A few requested to remain even after their service ended. They married local women, farmed the nearby land, and became part of the quiet human landscape that clung to the wall's shadow. For them, the wall was not merely a symbol of duty or suffering. It was home. But for most, it remained a cage built of stone and silence. The empire depended on their endurance, on their willingness to be forgotten. In every dynasty, in every outpost, the same cycle repeated: duty, decay, renewal. Each emperor claimed to rebuild the wall stronger than before. But what truly persisted were the patterns of labor and loneliness etched into its length. By night, as the wind moaned through the cracks, a sentry might lift his gaze toward the horizon, seeing faint stars through the shifting clouds. He might wonder what lay beyond the wall, not in terms of geography, but of life itself. Beyond duty, beyond empire, beyond memory, the wall stood still, offering no answer. Only the wind replied, whispering in the same rhythm as the footsteps of those who once built it. And so, across centuries, the soldiers of the wall watched and waited, their lives merging with the stone until the two became indistinguishable. Men turned into monuments, monuments turned into dust. One might ask, in the endless silence of that frontier, centuries pass quietly when measured by stone. Dynasties rise and fall, their banners turning to ash, but the wall remains. Long after the emperors who built it have become little more than footnotes in forgotten scrolls. The wall endures because it has no choice. It was built not to live, but to last. By the time of the Ming dynasty in the 14th and 15th centuries, the wall was already ancient. Entire sections had eroded back into the soil, others buried beneath dunes, and still others swallowed by the encroaching steppe. The Ming emperors, inheriting an empire fractured by invasion and rebellion, ordered a great rebuilding, not from rammed earth, as their ancestors had done, but from brick and stone. The new wall was harder, cleaner, more geometric. It reflected the bureaucratic precision of the Ming mind, measured, recorded, certified, and taxed. You might imagine the sound of this rebuilding. Chisels against stone, the rhythmic grind of carts carrying bricks up steep mountain paths. The same laborers returned, though their names were different. They still worked under the sun and the whip. Their food still rationed, their graves still shallow. The centuries had changed everything and nothing. The empire continued to defend itself from the idea of chaos, and the wall remained its most visible expression of that fear. Unlike the Qin and Han walls, the Ming wall was lined with fortresses and beacon towers spaced at regular intervals. Its design was almost mathematical. Engineers mapped the terrain with remarkable precision, aligning the wall along ridges and riverbeds to take advantage of the natural landscape. It was less a single barrier and more a system, a network of walls, trenches, and roads that could move armies faster than ever before. But the logic behind it remained the same: to draw a line between civilization and the world beyond. The Mongols, the great horsemen of the steppe, were the most persistent enemy. Yet ironically, the Mongols had once ruled China as the Yuan dynasty. They too had maintained and garrisoned sections of the wall. In time, even the invaders found use for the symbol they had once defied. The wall was less a weapon than a mirror. Whoever ruled China eventually saw themselves reflected in its length. For the garrisons of the Ming era, life continued as before. Soldiers manned the towers, walked the parapets, and watched the empty plains. But now they carried firearms instead of bows, wore quilted armor lined with iron plates, and reported to officers who kept meticulous records in triplicate. The empire's bureaucracy had grown as vast and heavy as the wall itself. In the archives of Beijing's imperial city, there are still scrolls listing the daily consumption of garrisons along the northern frontier. How many bolts of cloth were issued, how many jars of pickled cabbage, how many candles burned per night of duty. The documents are astonishing in their completeness. They speak of a world where every act, even a sip of tea or the lighting of a torch, had to be accounted for. Yet, they say little of the people who performed them. The humanity of the wall was buried in numbers. For peasants living near the wall, it was both a curse and a livelihood. It drained taxes and labor but also offered trade. Villagers sold food, wine, and even firewood to soldiers. Small markets grew beside fortresses, where one could buy grain, pottery, or news. Sometimes families settled in the shadow of the wall, tending fields that clung to thin soil. When the wind blew hard from the north, they could taste the dust of centuries in the air. The wall became part of the landscape of ordinary life. Travelers walked beside it, traders used it as a guide through the desert, monks meditated in its towers. What had begun as a defense became slowly a companion to human endurance. And yet, even as the Ming perfected the wall, its purpose was fading. The empire faced threats not only from horsemen but from within: corruption, famine, rebellion. When the Manchus rose in the 17th century, the wall did not stop them. The gates opened, the soldiers surrendered, and the Qing dynasty was born. The Great Wall, for all its strength, could not defend against the weakness of its own people. After the Qing conquest, the wall fell into neglect. It was no longer repaired, no longer garrisoned. Towers crumbled. Stones were taken by villagers to build homes and wells. The wall dissolved quietly into the lives of those who lived near it. Its grandeur became local, domestic. A stone that once marked the empire's boundary might now serve as the corner of a farmer's hut. Travelers in the 18th and 19th centuries often wrote of their disappointment upon seeing the wall. Western explorers, guided by local farmers, found sections half buried and overgrown. It is less a wall, one British visitor remarked in 1793, than the memory of a wall. Yet even they sensed its gravity, not as an architectural marvel, but as a relic of endurance. It had been built for eternity, and eternity had already begun to forget it. As China entered the modern age, the wall continued to fade from relevance. Railways cut through its ridges, telegraph wires crossed its path. Wars came and went: the Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Uprising, the Japanese invasion. In each, the wall stood indifferent, neither shield nor participant. By the 20th century, it was more ruin than rampart, a ghost of empire stretching across the horizon. And still, the wall persisted. It no longer served emperors or generals, but it served memory. It became a reminder of what humanity can build when driven by fear, ambition, or the illusion of permanence. Travelers who walk its length today, in places like Badaling, Jiayuguan and Muchinyu, trace not the story of conquest, but of continuity. Every worn step bears the imprint of centuries. Archaeologists studying the wall today have discovered remarkable things. Fragments of ancient shoes, broken tools, even scraps of handwritten notes preserved in the dry air. One letter, found in a Han watchtower, reads, "The autumn wind has arrived. The nights grow cold. If this message reaches home, tell my son to study hard. Let him never come to the frontier." It is the kind of message written countless times across history. A simple wish for escape, for peace, for the end of duty. The empire may have forgotten these men, but the wall remembers. In certain remote stretches of Gansu and Inner Mongolia, the wall looks less like a barrier and more like a natural ridge, its lines softened by erosion, its color blending with the desert. Shepherds guide their flocks across it, unaware that they tread on what was once the edge of the civilized world. From a distance, the wall is indistinguishable from the land itself. Perhaps that was its destiny all along, to return to the earth it was built from. When the wind blows over those ruins today, it carries the same sound that echoed there 2,000 years ago, the hollow whisper of dust against stone. It is the voice of the past, repeating itself endlessly. For every civilization that rises and builds walls, the pattern is the same: effort, order, decay, forgetting. The wall is the perfect metaphor not because it resists time, but because it yields to it. In 1987, UNESCO declared the Great Wall a World Heritage Site. It was a gesture of reverence but also of irony. The structure that once marked division now symbolizes unity, a relic preserved by the same world it once sought to exclude. Tourists walk where soldiers once froze. Photographers capture its silhouette against the sunset. Yet beneath the awe there is quiet. The same quiet that has always surrounded it. You can still find places where the wall is untouched by restoration, long, crumbling ridges where the grass grows between ancient bricks. If you stand there at dusk, the light softens, the wind hums low, and the world feels very old. The wall stretches into the distance, dissolving into haze. There is no sound of conquest or triumph, only the faint pulse of endurance. The empire of dust remains, not in glory, not in memory, but in texture, in the feel of earth under the fingertips, in the weight of stone balanced against the sky. It endures because the human desire to build, to protect, to remember, endures with it. And perhaps that is the wall's final lesson, that all walls are temporary, but the act of building them is eternal. Each stone is a record of fear and hope, ambition and futility, the quiet vocabulary of civilization. As the wind moves over the ridges, carrying sand and time alike, one question remains, floating like a ghost along the battlements. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe began to fall quiet. Bells tolled not for prayer but for warning. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with the scent of smoke and sickness. From one town to the next, the same story repeated. Doors barred, markets empty, roads abandoned except for the few who had no choice but to travel. Among those few were the messengers. They were not soldiers, nor saints, nor heroes. They were the lifeline of a dying world, men who carried letters, decrees, and pleas for help through the fields of death. When the Black Death swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing perhaps half of the continent's population, the machinery of communication, the fragile network of riders, scribes, and couriers, did not stop. It simply moved more slowly, more fearfully, more alone. The Black Death was not the first plague, but it was the first to meet a Europe that depended on written connection. Kings and bishops, merchants and abbots, all relied on letters to maintain order. Without the post, even the living could not reach one another. And so, while villages burned their dead and cities closed their gates, the messengers rode. You can picture one of them, a man wrapped in coarse wool, riding a small, sturdy horse down a narrow dirt road. The year is 1348. His satchel is heavy with sealed letters. Some are royal commands, others personal pleas. He does not know what they say, nor whom they will reach. All he knows is that they must go forward. His name is lost to history, as most names are, but his duty was recorded. Medieval postmen were employed by royal households, merchant guilds, monasteries, or universities. They carried news and money, sometimes even relics or petitions to the Pope. In ordinary times, their routes were long but predictable. During the plague, every mile was a gamble with death. They rode through lands where entire towns had vanished. A chronicler in Siena wrote that the living could not bury the dead, and the letters went unanswered. The couriers passed through landscapes of silence. Orchards gone wild, churchyards overflowing, the faint smell of lime where bodies had been burned. Many wore scarves soaked in vinegar or pressed herbs under their noses, believing the scent would ward off the pestilence. It did not. But habit gave the illusion of control. Still, they persisted. The post had to continue. Empires, even dying ones, depend on paper. To manage the movement of letters, Europe relied on a complex but largely invisible network. The royal couriers of England, called the King's Posts, travelled under sealed writs granting them safe passage through towns and toll gates. In Italy, the papal post operated from Avignon, coordinating letters across the Alps to France, Germany, and Spain. In the trading cities of the Hanseatic League, merchant guilds maintained their own private messengers, carrying contracts and inventories between ports like Lobeck, Hamburg, and Bruges. When plague struck, many routes closed. Bridges were guarded, city gates locked. Letters were fumigated with smoke or vinegar before delivery. Some burned holes in the parchment, leaving messages half legible. Yet even in panic, bureaucracy persisted. A merchant in Venice might still demand an account of unpaid debts from a dying partner in Genoa. A bishop might still send instructions to a monastery already emptied by disease. Paper, in its way, denied death. There are records from Avignon describing special death couriers employed by the papal curia to carry news of plague outbreaks across Christendom. Their instructions were clear: do not linger, do not sleep indoors, do not approach towns unless summoned. Their pay was high, sometimes triple the usual rate, but few lived long enough to collect it. We know this because the archives of Avignon record the payments unclaimed. Even as the plague spread, letters continued to accumulate. Royal secretaries noted, with bureaucratic precision, the dates of dispatch and receipt, even when the recipients were long dead. In some archives, those letters still exist, their seals unbroken. To open them now is to read a voice that never reached its ear. To my beloved cousin in Bordeaux, one begins, dated 1349. Why are all in good health, and trust you remain so. The rest trails off, the ink has faded. Bordeaux was already lost by the time it arrived. Imagine, for a moment, the feeling of delivering such a letter. To an empty street, a locked gate, a silent house. The courier would wait a few minutes, call out, then nail the parchment to the door. His duty done, he would turn back down the road, his shadow stretching long across the dust. He would not know, perhaps, that the letter was the last sign of life that place would ever receive. It is difficult, now, to understand how central letters were to the medieval mind. In a world without telephones or telegraphs, a letter was not just communication, it was presence. To hold a letter was to hold the hand of the absent. It was proof that someone, somewhere remembered you. To lose the post was to vanish. Some couriers began to write their own small notes during the plague, fragments of diary scrawled in the margins of delivery ledgers. One preserved in the city of Basel reads, "Today I passed through Delsberg, none remain alive. I burned the letters as instructed. I write this so the world may know. These lines, brief and unadorned, are among the most honest testimonies we have of the Black Death. Not from scholars or clerics, but from a messenger doing his duty. For every city that closed its gates, another opened them too late. The couriers carried not only words, but unknowingly, the plague itself. Fleas hid in their clothes, rats in their saddlebags. Every letter delivered was also a risk, a chance for death to travel in paper form. Some towns began to fear the post more than the disease itself. They burned couriers' satchels upon arrival, demanded that letters be opened and aired outside the walls, or banned communication altogether. But isolation was an illusion. Even silence carries contagion. The fewer letters that arrived, the more rumour filled the gap, and rumour in medieval Europe was a powerful poison. Without the post, fear multiplied. In England, the royal couriers were ordered to keep riding, even through plague-stricken shires. One chronicler noted that the king's writs did not sleep, though all the realm did. Messengers were told to report the deaths of sheriffs, judges, and bishops, and to deliver replacements as fast as possible. In some counties, the crown replaced officials 3 or 4 times within a single year. The post was not merely a service, it was the nervous system of power. To stop it would mean the paralysis of the realm. For the messengers themselves, survival depended on small acts of caution. They carried their own water and food. They camped outside villages, sometimes sleeping in trees to avoid wild dogs and scavengers. Some wore bells, not unlike lepers, to warn the living of their approach. The sound of those bells, faint and hollow in the distance, became a symbol of dread. Yet they came anyway, because someone had to, and always they brought letters. Letters that spoke of taxes, inheritance, love, faith, or despair. Letters that crossed a continent collapsing into silence. Letters that continued to move long after the voices that wrote them had faded away. In the strange arithmetic of the plague, where life and death exchanged places daily, it was the messengers who kept the idea of civilization alive. Every time a courier handed over a parchment, sealed with wax, he was affirming a small, fragile truth that communication still existed, that humanity still spoke to itself, even in ruin. When you think of the Black Death, you might imagine chaos, and you would be right. But even chaos must be managed. Behind every sealed letter, behind every trembling messenger, there stood the officers of administration, the clerks, scribes, and postmasters who tried, somehow, to keep the machinery of governance running while the world fell apart. In the papal city of Avignon, the administrative heart of 14th century Europe, the plague arrived in early 1348. The city, swollen with cardinals, merchants, and pilgrims, was already a centre of correspondence. Every day, hundreds of letters entered and left its gates, papal decrees, indulgences, contracts, and pleas for mercy. Then, as the sickness spread, the rhythm changed. The couriers still came, but fewer left. Within months, half the population was gone. Yet the clerical offices remained open. Letters from this period survive, their language both formal and eerily calm. The papal secretariat continued to record deaths with the same bureaucratic phrasing it used for land disputes or tax accounts. In the Diocese of Limoges, the bishop deceased of pestilence, a replacement to be named. In the Priory of Béziers, 6 brothers perished. Property inventory follows. Even the letters of condolence had templates, lines copied and recopied by wary scribes who no longer knew for whom they were writing. Bureaucracy, it seemed, could outlive even grief. Avignon's postal network stretched across all of Christendom. The papal curia relied on a series of official dispatch riders, cursors, who carried messages between the papal palace and regional offices. Each courier was issued a wooden staff marked with the seal of St. Peter, a passport through every toll gate in Europe. Their paybooks record each journey, down to the number of horses used and the nights spent on the road. In the plague years, the ledgers begin to break. Names are crossed out. Rotes end abruptly. Margins fill with notes like morbo correptus, seized by sickness. In some months, the records show no departures at all, followed by sudden bursts of frantic correspondence. Papal orders to quarantine monasteries, instructions to bless cemeteries, decrees for mass burials. In the midst of this, the clerks kept writing. That, perhaps, was their greatest act of endurance. Not courage in battle, but the quiet persistence of ink on parchment. A single desk in Avignon might handle hundreds of documents a week. The scribes sat close together, bent under the low light of oil lamps, the smell of vinegar and fear thick in the air. Every quill stroke was a repetition, named date, replacement, the monotonous chant of civilization recording its own decline. Somewhere in those ledgers is the faint trace of human fatigue, handwriting that grows shakier, margins filled with half-erased prayers, notes like Dies nos custodiat, God keep us. The administration of death required order. The Pope's offices had to know which dioceses were vacant, which monasteries were destroyed, which cities could still send taxes. Without this knowledge, the structure of authority would collapse completely. So the paperwork continued, even as the clerks coughed into their sleeves. Outside Avignon, the plague's administrative echo spread. In England, royal chancery officials continued to issue writs and proclamations, sealing them with wax and sending them through nearly deserted towns. The clerks in Westminster kept precise counts of how many officers had died in each county, not out of sentiment, but to calculate how to redistribute their estates to the crown. It was a world where death itself became a statistic. One remarkable document from 1350, now in the British National Archives, lists the deaths of court officials by cause of the great mortality. The handwriting changes midway. The original scribe evidently died before finishing. The replacement, likely a younger clerk, resumes the list without comment. A simple shift in ink color marks the passing of one life to another. That quiet continuity, the ink unbroken, the record maintained, was the heartbeat of medieval bureaucracy. Even when the people died, the paper lived. Elsewhere in the city-states of Italy, merchant administrations struggled to manage the disruption of trade. The port of Genoa was one of the first places to be struck by plague, carried there by ships from the Crimea. By summer of 1348, its docks were choked with abandoned cargoes and rotting goods. The city's commercial records show a sudden stop in transactions, followed by a strange resumption months later, not because trade had revived, but because merchants were settling the debts of the dead. Some letters from Genoese notaries survive, pages of meticulous handwriting cataloguing every chest, bale, and coin owed to vanished partners. The tone is entirely unemotional. Even in mass death, the grammar of commerce persisted. Item: 1 trunk of wool cloth, belonging to Matteo di Gallo, deceased by pestilence, to be divided among his creditors. Each item is a ghost, a fragment of someone's livelihood, reduced to inventory. In Florence, the city's government tried to maintain tax collection through the worst months of 1348. Officials known as gabellieri were sent into neighborhoods to record deaths and assess inheritances. They too often died before completing their rounds. Replacement officials were appointed, who sometimes died within days. Still, the records continued, partial, messy, but continuous. In one surviving tax ledger, entries stop abruptly mid-sentence, then resume weeks later in a new hand. The break is unmarked, unacknowledged, as if the scribe had merely paused to sharpen his quill rather than succumb to plague. The administration of death was never dramatic. It was dull, repetitive, and necessary. The very dullness was its power. In a world of panic, The act of writing, of sorting, listing, and recording was a kind of resistance. It was the mind's refusal to surrender to chaos. And yet even bureaucracy began to adapt to mortality. The papal chancery issued new guidelines for clerks handling documents from infected regions. Letters were to be aired over fire, sprinkled with vinegar, or left untouched for several days before reading. Some were copied onto fresh parchment, the originals burned. Others were sealed in small wooden boxes and labeled periculosa, dangerous. It was, in a sense, the birth of archival quarantine, but perhaps the strangest record from this era is not an official decree or a merchant's account. It comes from a small parish in southern France, where a local notary named Pierre Dubois kept a private book of the dead. It is not a register, exactly, more like a collection of small notes written between his legal documents. Each entry names a friend, a neighbor, or a client, followed by a brief remark. Jane the miller, a good man, buried in haste. Marguerite the widow, found peace. The messenger from Arles, took letters to no one. Her Dubois notations run for 2 years, growing shorter as they go. His handwriting weakens, then stops. The book itself survived because it was used, years later, as scrap parchment by another notary. That, too, is a kind of immortality, to be forgotten but not destroyed. Across Europe, similar fragments remain: tax rolls half-filled, legal petitions never answered, letters never delivered. Each is a glimpse into the administrative endurance of a civilization that refused to acknowledge its own collapse. The machinery of governance kept moving, even when there was almost no one left to govern. But there is a certain irony in that persistence. The clerks who wrote so diligently to preserve order were, in doing so, also preserving memory, not of kings or wars, but of ordinary lives caught in paperwork. And as the plague receded, those papers became the foundation of reconstruction. They were the record of who had lived, who had died, who still owed debts, who had land to reclaim. From the boredom of bureaucracy came the first efforts at rebuilding. Still, one must wonder, as the ink dried on those endless ledgers, as the scribes dipped their quills again and again in the shadow of death, whether any of them paused to think of the futility of their task. To write a name today, only for it to be crossed out tomorrow, to catalogue a kingdom of corpses in perfect alphabetical order. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip on Europe around 1351, the survivors emerged into a landscape that was both familiar and foreign. The fields still existed, the roads still wound between towns, the churches still stood, but everything else felt hollowed out. The plague had taken half the people, perhaps more in some regions. Villages were empty, the air clear of smoke, and the great cities smelled of dust instead of life. What remained was not only physical ruin, but an administrative and emotional one: unanswered letters, vacant offices, unread decrees, a world whose messages had no listeners. In the months after the pestilence, the couriers began to ride again. Their routes, long deserted, reopened one by one, like nerves healing after injury. Riders carried letters announcing deaths, inheritances, and the slow resumption of commerce in England. The king's messengers were ordered to resume the accustomed conveyance of royal writs throughout the realm. In Florence, notaries took up their ledgers again, sorting through estates that belonged to no one. But something fundamental had changed. The tone of the surviving letters from the early 1350s is subdued, cautious, restrained. The language of Europe itself had shifted from the certainty of divine order to a kind of quiet uncertainty. One Florentine merchant wrote, "I send you greetings, though I do not know if you yet live." A formula that once began every letter, "To my dear friend in good health," became, after the plague, almost superstitious. Health was no longer assumed. Communication had to cross not just distance but mortality. The postal systems, too, began to evolve. The plague had shown how fragile communication could be when dependent on individual riders. Many lords and states began formalizing their own courier networks, turning what had once been an informal web of messengers into state-controlled systems. In Venice, the government issued new regulations for public posts, defining routes, wages, and quarantine measures for couriers. They were required to stop at designated stations where letters and parcels were aired over smoke. Each rider carried a certificate proving his health and that of his horse. It was the first faint outline of a postal bureaucracy that would, centuries later, become the modern mail system. But beyond organization, the plague changed something deeper. It altered how people thought about writing itself. Letters had always been vessels of presence, a way to connect the living. Now, they were also relics of the dead. In monasteries, monks began collecting correspondence not just for record-keeping, but as memorials. The Benedictines of St. Denis preserved bundles of parchment from deceased abbots, binding them into what they called Liber Epistolarum Defunctorum, the book of letters of the dead. Each letter, even trivial ones about teethers or repairs, was treated as sacred testimony. The act of writing had become a way of keeping souls alive. We find traces of this shift in private collections as well. Wealthy families, particularly in Italy and Flanders, began storing letters as heirlooms. Some had them copied into illuminated books, decorated with initials and prayers. One surviving example, belonging to a merchant family in Bruges, includes letters exchanged before and during the plague, followed by a simple inscription. "Here are the words of those who no longer speak." That phrase, quiet and almost casual, captures something of the new European spirit, a recognition that writing was no longer just communication, but preservation. The messengers themselves, those nameless riders who had risked everything, rarely left written traces. But there are hints of their legacy. In the city of Lobeck, a guild of couriers was formed in the decades after the plague, dedicated to Saint Christopher, the patron of travellers. Its founding charter mentions those who bore letters through sickness and shadow. The guild adopted as its emblem a sealed envelope surrounded by rays, a small, defiant symbol of endurance. It was, in essence, a memorial to the profession that had carried civilization through its darkest hours. Meanwhile, the great bureaucracies of Europe began reorganizing. In Avignon, the papal curia recovered from its decimation with surprising speed. Within 5 years, the chancery was again issuing thousands of letters per month. Yet the tone of these new documents reflects a different world. The clerks, trained by Loss, began keeping more detailed registers, not just names and offices, but locations, dates, and causes of death. This growing obsession with documentation laid the foundation for later administrative practices, birth and death certificates, censuses, public health reports. The age of paperwork, of written control over human life, was born from plague, and with it came a new kind of fear, not of dying, but of being forgotten. The written word, once a luxury of the educated, became a form of survival. More people began learning to write, to record their own presence. Testamentary writing, wills, inventories, lists, flourished. A will was no longer just a legal document, it was a way of asserting that one's life had mattered. The post, too, became an act of reassurance. To send a letter was to declare, "I am still here." In England, a small note survives from a royal clerk named Thomas of Merton, written to a friend in 1353. It reads simply, "All London is yet uneasy. I write only to prove that I remain." A sentence so plain, and yet it contains the entire essence of a society learning to exist after mass death. The silence that followed the Black Death was not empty. It was full of echoes, of conversations that had ended too soon, of letters that never found their way, of scribes who kept writing into the void. Those echoes lingered for generations. Even as Europe recovered, the plague haunted its communication. People wrote more carefully, more deliberately. Words carried weight. Perhaps that is why, in the decades after the plague, we see an explosion of chroniclers, notaries, and diarists, ordinary people writing history from their own perspective. The habit of record-keeping, born from necessity, became a cultural instinct. In a way, every bureaucrat and postmaster of the plague years was an accidental historian, preserving the fragments of a vanished world. The letters they handled, so dull, so procedural, now read like prayers. They tell us who lived, who wrote, who tried to keep the machinery of life turning. In their monotony lies something sacred, the rhythm of continuity. Because when everything else stopped, the writing did not. It is easy to think of history as the record of great events, wars, coronations, revolutions. But the Black Death shows us another kind of history, one built on the small, unremarkable persistence of clerks and messengers. People who, in their quiet duties, ensured that memory itself did not perish. Today, in archives across Europe, their work endures. Bundles of parchment browned with age, covered in cramped Gothic script, still carry the faint scent of smoke and time. Many remain sealed. No one knows whether they contain pleas for help, royal decrees, or simple greetings. They are the last letters of the dead, waiting to be read by a world that survived them. And if you listen closely, in the quiet of a library, or in the stillness before sleep, you might almost hear them, the whisper of quills, the shuffle of parchment, the soft tread of a messenger's boots on a long, empty road. The mail of the dead still travels in its way across the centuries, because every civilization, sooner or later, must learn this truth. It is not the noise of life that endures, but the persistence of communication. Paris, in the 18th and early 19th centuries, was a city of light above ground. and of filth below it. The same city that dazzled visitors with its boulevards, theatres and cafes was built over a dark, labyrinthine underworld, a network of drains, cesspools, and open channels carrying away what the polite world preferred not to see. And yet it was this hidden world, stinking, overlooked, and perpetually damp, that kept the great capital alive. If you had walked through Paris in 1800, you would have smelled it before you saw it. The stench was not a single odour but a symphony. Rotting vegetable matter, stagnant water, human waste, horse manure, and the sour smoke of tallow lamps. It clung to the air, thick and oily, drifting even into the homes of the wealthy. The Seine, that graceful ribbon cutting through the city, was both lifeline and sewer. Its waters carried barges, laundry, and every imaginable form of refuse. Paris had grown too large for its own infrastructure. The medieval city had relied on open ditches known as agouts de ciel ouvert, gutters that ran down the middle of streets, carrying waste toward the river. During rainstorms, these channels overflowed. During droughts, they congealed into stagnant sludge. People poured chamber pots from their windows, calling out the traditional warning, "Grrr! Mind the water!" before emptying their waste onto the cobblestones. The phrase became a symbol of urban life, half joke, half survival tactic. The rich had servants to manage their filth. The poor simply added theirs to the street. But by the 18th century, the smell had become a political issue. Visitors from abroad commented on it with fascination and disgust. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau described Paris as a vast sewer. Foreign diplomats requested meetings outdoors, claiming the palace corridors smelled unbearable. Even the French themselves began to worry that the air might not just offend the nose, but endanger the body. This was the era of miasma theory, the belief that disease was carried by foul air. Before the discovery of germs, people assumed that bad smells caused illness. The connection, though mistaken, had a curious effect. It made cleanliness a civic duty. To cleanse the city was not merely to beautify it, but to purify its spirit. And so began one of the strangest, slowest revolutions in European history, the transformation of sanitation from superstition into science. The early stages were chaotic. Engineers tried to improve drainage using the tools of medieval logic, digging deeper ditches, covering them with wooden planks, or directing waste into large pits known as fosses d'Azance. These pits, often located beneath houses, were meant to be emptied periodically by vidangers, nightmen who worked by lantern, hauling up buckets of sludge and carting it out of the city. Their work was invisible, indispensable, and utterly despised. The vidangers were the lowest of the low in Parisian society. They worked at night to avoid the public gaze, moving through alleys with horses and barrels, their clothes soaked with the filth they removed. Yet they were highly organized, with licenses, routes, and fees set by the city. Without them, Paris would have drowned in its own waste. A report from 1740 estimated that more than 30,000 cesspits lay beneath the city, some overflowing, some forgotten. In certain neighborhoods, the ground itself had become unstable, softened by centuries of seepage. The historian Louis Sebastien Mercier wrote that the earth beneath us is a sponge of corruption. Still, progress came slowly. The first enclosed sewers were built under the reign of Louis Echevy, beginning around 1667, when the Lieutenant General of Police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, ordered the covering of several major drains. These early underground channels were little more than vaulted tunnels lined with brick. They carried waste directly into the Seine, moving the problem but not solving it. By the time of Napoleon Bonaparte, sanitation had become a matter of statecraft. The emperor, obsessed with order and efficiency, commissioned surveys of the city's underbelly. His engineers drew maps of every drain, every outlet, every cesspit. The resulting plans revealed a city divided by its own waste, neighborhoods of wealth and air uphill, and basins of poverty and disease below. In 1805, Napoleon ordered a comprehensive sewer renovation. The project fell to the engineer Pierre-Emmanuel Brunceau, a man whose name few remember but whose work defined modern Paris. Brunceau's task was monumental: to enter the sewers, chart them, and reconstruct them from the inside out. He descended with lanterns and assistants into the subterranean dark, wading through ankle-deep muck and waist-deep water. Rats scurried along the walls. The air was so thick with methane that torches sometimes hissed and died. Brunceau carried a pistol, not for the rats, but for the thieves and vagrants who sometimes hid in the tunnels. He emerged, after years of work, with a full survey of more than 30 kilometers of underground passage, the first complete map of Paris's hidden world. Victor Hugo would later immortalize these tunnels in Les Miserables, describing them as a sort of dark mirror in which the city contemplates itself. But in Brunceau's time, they were less metaphor than survival. His maps became the foundation for the great sanitation reforms of the 19th century, and yet progress remained painfully slow. For decades, the upper classes resisted funding large-scale projects. They viewed sanitation as a luxury, not a necessity, something for the poor districts, not their own. The idea of spending millions of francs on invisible tunnels seemed absurd. Politicians argued that good manners and perfume suffice for health. Meanwhile, cholera arrived. In 1832, an outbreak swept through Paris, killing over 18,000 people in 6 months. The disease struck hardest in the working-class districts where open drains still ran beside the streets. Physicians, still guided by miasma theory, blamed the poisoned air. Engineers, however, began to see the truth. The problem was not smell, but water. Contaminated wells and runoff from cesspits were spreading the disease. The realization marked a turning point. The city began to view sanitation not just as an aesthetic improvement, but as a matter of life and death. The sewers, once ignored, became the focus of intense study and innovation. New tunnels were built with vaulted ceilings and smooth stone floors. Iron gates were installed to control water flow. Every addition was recorded meticulously in the ledgers of the Service des Gouttes, the sewer department, a bureaucracy as precise as it was damp. By mid-century, Paris was being transformed. The underground grew in complexity as the surface world modernized. Roads widened, bridges rose, and under them ran the veins of the new metropolis, the invisible arteries of sanitation. Still above ground, the memory of filth lingered. The people of Paris could not yet imagine a city without smell. The scent of the Seine, sour and sweet, was as much a part of Paris as the bells of Notre Dame. And beneath those cobblestones, the engineers kept digging, deeper, cleaner, more ambitious each year. The city's future was being built in shadow, brick by brick, with little glory and less recognition. Progress, like sewage, flowed slowly. But how do you measure civilization? By what it builds above ground, or by what it hides beneath? If Section 1 introduced you to the problem of filth, Section 2 takes you to the minds that sought to master it. And it begins, as many of Paris's transformations did, with Napoleon III and the man who built his vision, Baron Georges Eugenie Haussmann. By the mid-19th century, Paris was a contradiction. It was both the capital of refinement and the capital of cholera. The boulevards were beautiful, but behind them lay a tangle of alleys, cesspools, and stagnant canals. The air itself carried whispers of decay, and yet beneath that surface, a revolution in urban engineering was taking shape, one of geometry, hydraulics, and bureaucracy. Haussmann's mandate was clear: rebuild Paris from the ground up. He widened its streets, demolished slums, and created the orderly boulevards that still define the city today. But what few noticed, at least at first, was that the true foundation of his Paris was invisible. Haussmann's greatest ally in this underground conquest was an engineer named Eugenie Belgrand, a man whose obsession with water bordered on the monastic. Belgrand had been a student of geology and hydrology, fascinated by the movement of underground springs. He believed that Paris's salvation lay not merely in removing waste but in managing water itself, its sources, its courses, and its exits. When Belgrand took charge of the city's water and sewer systems in 1854, he inherited a labyrinth that was half medieval, half modern. The tunnels dug by Brunceau still existed, but they were narrow, inconsistent, and poorly ventilated. New pipes had been added haphazardly, creating a network that resembled a root system more than a plan. Some sections were so small that only rats could pass through. Others were so wide that a man could row a boat along them. Belgrand saw not chaos but opportunity. He proposed a completely new vision of sanitation, one that would separate waste from clean water, control storm runoff, and regulate the flow of the Seine. His dream was to create an integrated hydraulic city, a living organism where every drop had a purpose. The scope of his ambition was staggering. He began by charting every slope, every gradient, every corner of the Paris basin. The city's terrain was uneven, with hills in the north and east, and low plains along the river. To make the sewers flow naturally, Belgrand designed them with mathematical precision, using gravity as the primary engine. Each main tunnel was built to maintain a consistent slope, steep enough to move waste, but gentle enough to prevent erosion. He insisted that the tunnels be large enough for men to walk through upright. His reasoning was practical and symbolic. If workers could walk the tunnels, they could inspect them, and if citizens could see them, they might respect them. He even arranged public tours of the sewers, transforming what had once been a source of shame into a spectacle of progress. Visitors descended by ladder into clean, arched tunnels lit by gas lamps, where uniformed sewer workers, the agotiers, guided them along raised walkways. The tourists marveled at the engineering, the brickwork, the echoing acoustics, the steady, rhythmic trickle of water. Some described the experience as descending into the veins of civilization. This was the age of order, and Belgrade was its quiet prophet. He built more than 600 kilometers of underground tunnels, each one labeled, mapped, and integrated into a coherent system. The waste of Paris no longer simply vanished into the Seine. It was directed, regulated, and eventually repurposed. The new sewers were designed with inspection galleries, sluice gates, and pumping stations, all of which could be controlled manually by the agotiers. These workers became something of an urban legend. They wore heavy oilskin coats, high boots, and lamps strapped to their chests. They moved silently through the tunnels, sweeping debris from the flow, clearing blockages, and ensuring that the great machine of the city never stalled. Their work was dirty but honorable, and Belgrade treated them as essential citizens of the modern age. He once said, "The sewer worker is the true guardian of Paris." And indeed they were. During floods, they closed gates to prevent backflow. During storms, they redirected runoff into underground reservoirs. They knew the city's underbelly better than any cartographer. Some spent decades working in the same sections, navigating by sound, smell, and instinct. Above ground, Parisians walked along the new boulevards without realizing that each street mirrored a sewer below. The alignment was deliberate, a perfect symmetry between surface and substructure. Every new avenue demanded a new sewer. Every new fountain required a new water main. Belgrade's city was not just built, it was plumbed. Yet for all its efficiency, the system had its mysteries. The tunnels were vast enough to hide things, not just rats and runoff but people. In times of political unrest, revolutionaries used the sewers as secret roads. During the Commune of 1871, insurgents fled through them, disappearing beneath the soldiers' boots. Later, during the German occupation of World War II, members of the French resistance used the same passages to move messages, weapons, and men. But in the 19th century, the sewers symbolized something far grander than rebellion. They were the conscience of the modern city, the proof that civilization could master its own waste. Writers and philosophers visited them in awe. Victor Hugo wrote, "The sewer is the conscience of the city. All the uncleanliness of civilization, once it is below the ground, becomes purity." For Hugo, the tunnels represented both the moral and physical cleansing of society, the transformation of chaos into order. Still, the work was never truly finished. Belgrade's designs required constant maintenance, and the agotiers became permanent fixtures of Parisian life. Their daily routine was as ritualistic as a monk's descend, inspect, repair, emerge. They developed their own language, superstitions, and customs. Some claimed they could tell which district they were beneath by the sound of the water or the taste of the air. And so, beneath the glittering avenues of the Second Empire, a parallel world existed, one that mirrored the surface in every respect, yet remained unseen by most. The flow was constant, a low murmur that carried the breath of the city. It reminded Paris that even beauty must be managed, and that beneath elegance lies effort. But there was one flaw in Belgrade's masterpiece. Though the sewers could carry waste away, they still had nowhere good to put it. The Seine remained the final destination, now cleaner, but still burdened. Belgrade dreamed of using sewage to fertilize fields outside the city, creating a self-sustaining cycle of life and decay. He even tested it on experimental farms, where crops grew astonishingly well in the nutrient-rich runoff. But bureaucracy, politics, and the limits of technology stood in his way. Paris, for all its ambition, was still chained to the river that both nourished and polluted it. As Belgrade grew older, he continued to refine his system, expanding, mapping, improving, but he knew the work would outlive him. The sewers were not just a public utility, they were an inheritance. Each generation would have to descend again, lantern in hand, to ensure that the waters kept flowing. When he died in 1878, the city mourned him quietly. His name was carved on a small plaque inside the main sewer near the Place de la Concorde, a fitting tombstone for a man who believed civilization's truest beauty lay underground. And yet, as the century turned, new dangers began to rise from the depths. The industrial age brought chemicals, oils, and modern pollutants that no sewer could easily handle. The water grew darker, the flow heavier, the air more toxic. What began as a triumph of cleanliness was slowly becoming another frontier of contamination. The engineers had conquered filth, but had they truly mastered its consequences? By the end of the 19th century, Paris had become two cities, One glittered in the sunlight cafes' arcades, and the hum of carriages on horsemen's boulevards. The other lay below, silent, damp, and ceaselessly at work. It was a world of shadows and brick, of flowing water and echoing footsteps, a mechanical underworld that kept the upper one alive. Tourists still came to see it, descending by lantern light into the famous Gouts de Paris. They expected filth and horror. What they found instead was a cathedral of stone, arches stretching above canals, with boats drifting on dark water. Gas lamps glowed faintly against the moisture. The air smelled of iron, silt, and something faintly chemical. It was not pleasant, but it was orderly. And that in 19th century Paris was a kind of miracle. The visitors marveled not at beauty, but at function. Here was modernity rendered in brick and mortar, a city that managed its own decay. Guides explained the flow, how stormwater, waste, and runoff were diverted through separate conduits, how inspection boats traveled the tunnels, how sluice gates opened like lungs to breathe the city clean. Everything had a system, a rhythm, a logic. For the first time, civilization had made sanitation visible and strangely respectable. But beneath the admiration lingered unease. The sewer was both achievement and mirror, reflecting not only human ingenuity, but also the filth it sought to conceal. It was progress built on perpetual maintenance, a monument to the fact that cleanliness must be earned, every day, by unseen hands. Those unseen hands, the égoutiers, had become part of Paris's mythology. They were the custodians of its underworld, men whose faces few saw, whose names were seldom recorded. Yet their work was continuous. Each morning they gathered at the depots, drinking black coffee before descending into the tunnels through iron hatches scattered across the streets. Their equipment was simple heavy boots, lanterns, shovels, hooks, and small boats. They walked the length of Paris beneath the pavement, clearing debris, measuring flow, noting leaks. Their world was one of endless twilight. The only light came from the reflections of their lamps on the water's surface. The soundscape was peculiar. The slow drip of condensation, the occasional rush of a passing discharge, the echo of their own voices returning distorted by distance. For them, time behaved differently. Days passed without sky. The city above was merely rumor, its seasons marked only by the temperature of the water. By the turn of the 20th century, the Paris sewers extended for more than 1,000 kilometers, a vast organism pulsing quietly beneath the boulevards. Its complexity astonished engineers from abroad. Visitors from London, Vienna, and New York came to study it. Some returned home inspired to build their own systems. Others concluded that no city could match Paris's underground discipline. Yet even as it expanded, the sewer's role began to shift. No longer merely a mechanism for waste, it became a symbol of modern control. A way of organizing not just matter but life itself. Sanitation was now a form of governance. Inspectors tracked every cubic meter of flow, and citizens paid for their connection to the system. Waste became data, and in this growing bureaucracy of cleanliness, Paris faced new questions. What counted as clean? What did progress mean when even the purest water was touched by industry? Factories now poured effluents into the Seine. Detergents, dyes, and oils changed the composition of the water. Belgren's dream of recycling sewage into fertilizer was briefly revived, but proved too complex. The nutrient-rich runoff carried heavy metals and industrial waste, poisons that no field could safely absorb. Still, the flow continued. The system, vast and tireless, adapted but never slept. In 1910, when the Seine flooded disastrously, the sewers became both savior and saboteur. They channeled excess water away from some districts but burst open in others, sending foul backflows into basements and streets. For days, Paris smelled like the Middle Ages again. It was a reminder that beneath every order lies the potential for chaos, a truth as ancient as the city itself. As decades passed, the égoutiers evolved with the times. They adopted rubber suits, portable lamps, and mechanized tools. The tunnels echoed with the whir of pumps and the hum of ventilation fans. Some sections were electrified, others still relied on the flicker of gaslight. The work remained dangerous. Methane explosions were rare but feared. Falls, drownings, and illness claimed lives every year. Yet the men continued, proud, stoic custodians of the flow. Their loyalty was not to fame or fortune, but to the functioning of the invisible. One égoutier was once asked by a journalist if he ever tired of the smell. He replied simply, "Above ground, it smells like lies. Down here, everything is honest." By the mid-20th century, Paris had become cleaner but also more complicated. The population had tripled, water usage had soared. The old tunnels strained to handle modern life. Showers, dishwashers, industrial runoff. The city responded by expanding again, building new collectors and treatment plants outside its borders. What had begun as a desperate attempt to hide waste had become a model for environmental engineering. And so, by the late 20th century, Paris possessed something no medieval builder could have imagined: a circular system where wastewater was treated, purified, and returned to the river cleaner than before. The great dream of Belgrade, the sustainable city, had in some modest way been realized. Yet the philosophy of the sewer endures. It reminds us that civilization's perfection depends not on what we display, but on what we manage quietly. Every city, no matter how grand, produces waste. Every society must decide how to handle what it prefers not to see, and every act of cleansing leaves traces, material, moral, or historical. The Paris sewers remain open for public tours today. Visitors descend beneath the Pont de l'Alma, where the tunnels are dry and well lit. They read plaques about Brunceau, Belgrade, and the evolution of hygiene. They look at models of sluice gates and listen to recordings of rushing water. It feels educational, even quaint. But for the engineers and workers who keep the flow alive, it is never just history. It is a living system, one that demands vigilance, humility, and constant repair. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson of Paris's underworld. Progress is not the absence of filth, but the management of it. Cleanliness, like civilization, is not a state. It is a process, a slow, unending flow, and as you walk above those cobblestones, cafes glittering, perfume in the air, the river sliding by in silver calm, remember that beneath your feet runs the true heart of the city, invisible, indispensable, and always moving. Because civilization, in the end, is measured not by its monuments, but by its drains. If empires are remembered for their wars, their rulers, and their monuments, the British Empire was sustained by something far quieter. Paperwork, endless paperwork. For every cannon fired, there were forms to requisition it. For every colony claimed, there were ledgers, memos, and handwritten reports cataloguing the soil, the rivers, and the people. Somewhere, in a dim London office, a clerk recorded it all, carefully, methodically, in ink that dried slowly on government paper. It was, in its own way, a feat of control more impressive than conquest. The empire's borders stretched across continents, but its heart beat in file rooms and counting houses. The real power of Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries was not only naval or military, it was administrative. This is the story of how an empire ruled the world with paper. The birth of a paper machine. It began, appropriately enough, with a letter. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a charter granting a group of London merchants the right to trade with the East Indies. The document was handwritten on vellum, official, ornate, bearing the royal seal. It established the East India Company, a private corporation that would soon function as both merchant and government. That charter, like all things bureaucratic, demanded more writing. Soon there were minute books, shipping logs, and ledgers tracking every ounce of pepper and silk. Clerks filled entire warehouses with documents. They wrote by candlelight in cramped script, copying reports from distant ports, Surat, Madras, Batavia, into thick bound volumes. In a sense, these clerks were the empire's first civil servants. They never left England, but their pens reached across oceans. Through paperwork, they turned geography into inventory. By the 18th century, this method of governance had evolved into something almost sublime in its dullness. Every colonial action, from building a fort to issuing a tax, required written authorization, stamped and signed by multiple departments. Delays were epic. Ships could take 6 months to carry a letter to India and another 6 to bring back a reply. And yet, the machine functioned. The empire advanced one document at a time. The clerks themselves, the people who made this possible, were, by all accounts, unremarkable. They were men, and later, occasionally, women, who lived quiet lives in the margins of history. Their days were measured not in adventure but in correspondence. They began work at 9, finished at 5, and spent the hours in between surrounded by piles of forms. In the offices of the East India House on Lidenhall Street, the air smelled perpetually of ink and sealing wax. Clerks wore drab suits and green visors to protect their eyes from candle glare. They sharpened quills, copied figures, and indexed letters. Their handwriting was immaculate, their tempers mild. Some rose through the ranks, gaining small salaries and modest pensions. Others remained anonymous, their names preserved only on payroll lists. But collectively, they were the nervous system of empire. Their most famous representative was perhaps Charles Lamb, the essayist. Before he became a literary figure, Lamb worked for 33 years as a clerk in the East India Company. His essays described the monotony of bureaucratic life, the dry drudgery of the desk's dead wood. And yet, in his reflections, one senses pride. To write the empire into being was no small thing. Each signature, each ledger entry, was a stitch in a vast invisible fabric. Paper as power, paperwork became not just a means of control, but a symbol of civilization. British officials believed that proper record keeping distinguished them from the chaotic, administrated regions they governed. To document something, a tribe, a trade route, a rainfall measurement, was to assert dominion over it. The company's officials in India carried portable desks on campaign. In the midst of heat and dust, they filled forms and drafted reports on the behavior of local princes, the price of salt, and the exact number of cannonballs fired in battle. These papers traveled back to London, where committees read and summarize them, binding their conclusions into volumes that few would ever read. But that was the point. The act of recording was itself a form of control. To turn life into paper was to render it governable. The historian Thomas Babington Macaulay, himself a bureaucrat in Calcutta, once wrote that the empire's real triumph was not military but administrative. A single shelf of a good European library is worth the whole native literature of India. His arrogance aside, Macaulay captured something essential, the idea that knowledge through paperwork was power, even when that knowledge was partial or flawed. The routine of rule in London, the machinery of empire became a literal machine. By the early 19th century, the East India House employed more than 1,000 clerks. Their offices contained miles of shelving iron cabinets and drawers labelled with precise geographic hierarchies. Bombay Presidency, 1790-1800, Madras, Judicial Correspondence, Ceylon, miscellaneous. Each day, messengers carried bundles of letters from department to department. Each was logged, numbered, stamped, and filed. Mistakes were rare, slowness was expected. The system's perfection lay not in speed but in permanence. If a dispute arose, a question of trade, law, or land, the solution was sought not in negotiation but in paperwork. Consult the records, an official would say, and an assistant would descend into the archives, emerging hours later with a volume bound in calfskin and thick with dust. The paper spoke, men obeyed. To modern ears this may sound suffocating, an empire run by clerks. But to the Victorians it was a triumph of order. They saw in bureaucracy the highest form of civilization, government by documentation rather than by impulse. The chaos of the world could be tamed by the steady flow of ink. The paper empire expands as Britain's territories grew, so too did its paperwork. The Colonial Office, created in 1801, began collecting reports from Canada, the Caribbean, Africa, and Australia. Each governor was required to send quarterly dispatches, often hundreds of pages long, describing everything from rainfall to rebellion. In one surviving file, a governor in Sierra Leone reports the number of mosquito nets issued to soldiers, listing each by name and serial number. In another, an administrator in Ceylon writes apologetically for the delay in forwarding sugar export data. The forms had been damaged by humidity. Every detail mattered. The paperwork itself was proof that the empire was functioning, that it was, in the bureaucratic sense, real. It was also fragile. Ships sank, papers burned, ink faded. Whole sections of the imperial record vanished through mildew or misfiling. Yet even these absences had meaning. The empire was as much a creature of loss as of record. The weight of ink. By the mid-19th century, the paperwork had become nearly unmanageable. The East India Company alone produced over 1 million pages of correspondence per year. The archives filled faster than they could be catalogued. Clerks joked that someday the empire would collapse under the weight of its own documents. When the company was dissolved in 1858 after the Indian Rebellion, its records, millions of letters, orders, and ledgers, were absorbed into the British government. The empire had outgrown its private origins and become something more terrifyingly efficient: the modern civil service. New offices were built, staffed with graduates from Oxford and Cambridge, trained not in warfare but in procedure. They studied Latin and logic, disciplines of classification, and brought that same precision to the administration of people. The pen had fully conquered the sword. The British Empire would reach its height not through battles or gold, but through paperwork. Its clerks would continue to record, classify, and file until the system itself became too vast to comprehend. But what happens when an empire becomes more paperwork than power? When the machine of administration continues long after its purpose has faded? By the mid-19th century, the British Empire had perfected something extraordinary, a system that could govern itself through paper. It no longer required kings or conquerors to expand. It required clerks. In the humming offices of London, India House, and Whitehall, the bureaucracy of empire had become a living organism. Its lifeblood was correspondence, its bones were filing cabinets, and its heart, always beating, never resting, was the ledger. Yet, for all its precision, the empire's machinery was beginning to strain under its own creation. The paper flood, the numbers are staggering. By 1860, the British government received over 10 million documents per year from across its dominions, a volume so vast that it could no longer be read, only processed. Each colonial office, each naval department, each local district produced its own reports, copies, and summaries. The paperwork multiplied like coral, branching and repeating, until no one quite knew what was stored where. To cope, new layers of clerks were hired: copyists, indexers, sorters, and minute writers. Each had a distinct task in the hierarchy. The copyist made duplicates. The indexer catalogued them. The sorter arranged them into bound volumes. The minute writer drafted short summaries for the senior officials who lacked time to read the original reports. And so, the empire created paperwork to manage its paperwork. In a memorandum from 1863, an undersecretary wrote with wary precision, "The files of correspondence have grown to such an extent as to render their prompt examination wholly impracticable. It is proposed to subdivide the divisions of correspondence." It was bureaucracy devouring itself, yet it persisted. Because paperwork once begun cannot end. It must be filed, reviewed, and re-reviewed, each signature requiring another. The empire did not sleep, it merely shuffled. The sound of work. If you had entered the India office in London around 1870, you would have found a space both mundane and magnificent. Long rows of desks stretched beneath vaulted ceilings. Clerks sat side by side, sleeves rolled, pens scratching in rhythm. The sound was constant, a soft, papery music. A visitor once remarked that the place resembled a factory for thought. The metaphor was apt. Every sheet that left those desks represented a decision, a tax on salt, a boundary between kingdoms, the appointment of a judge, or the fate of a province. Yet the clerks themselves seldom understood the significance of what they wrote. They were trained to obey procedure, not to interpret meaning. Their task was to maintain the machine. There was comfort in this anonymity. A man might spend 30 years copying letters about trade in Bengal without ever seeing the Indian Ocean. His life was narrow but secure. He had a pension, a desk, and the satisfaction of order. Still, now and then, a whisper of doubt would pass through the office. Was this what empire meant? Endless paper, endless repetition. One clerk, Henry Cole, later a key figure in the creation of the Public Record Office, wrote in his journal, "Why are the keepers of a world made of documents? But sometimes I wonder whether the documents keep us." The machinery of memory. As the volume of records grew intolerable, Britain confronted a new problem: what to do with the past. The empire could not simply throw its documents away. They were evidence of authority, of precedent, of legality. Yet it could not keep everything either. Paper was costly, space limited, and bureaucratic time even more precious. So began the science of archival curation. In 1838, the government established the Public Record Office, a vast repository intended to store the essential papers of the realm. Here, under careful supervision, documents from centuries past were preserved, bound, and catalogued. Each parchment, each file was cleaned of dust and folded precisely to prevent creases. Clerks wrote long indexes by hand, describing the contents of each box. They used Latin tags and numerical codes, creating a taxonomy of empire. In theory, it was a triumph of preservation. In practice, it was a kind of burial. Thousands of reports and letters disappeared into the vaults, never to be read again. Their existence was acknowledged, their contents forgotten. The empire's memory became archival, a memory that remembered everything and nothing. A visitor to the record office in 1865 described the place as a necropolis of paper. He was not wrong. Empire by abbreviation. By the late 19th century, the British civil service had perfected the art of brevity. Reports grew shorter, more structured, more coded. Instead of full sentences, clerks used standard forms and abbreviations. Rect, end for received and entered. NO, ref, for no other reference. For HMG, for His Majesty's government. Entire careers were built on the mastery of such shorthand. Efficiency replaced eloquence, meaning gave way to form. A senior official might decide the fate of a region based on a 2-sentence summary: rebellion in northern province. Situation contained. Recommend reduction of levy by 1/3. The system worked precisely because it was impersonal. By removing emotion, paperwork made empire seem rational. But beneath this veneer of reason lay chaos. Local crises, human suffering, and the slow decay of authority. The papers that reached London were often outdated by the time they arrived. Famines, uprisings, and epidemics moved faster than the post. And yet the paperwork never stopped. When a famine swept through Bengal in 1876, the official response took months to coordinate. The reports that documented the crisis filled hundreds of volumes. Statistics of mortality, grain prices, rainfall data, but by the time the final report was signed, over 5 million people were dead. In London, the famine existed only as paper. The clerks abroad, even at the peripheries of empire, the bureaucratic order held. British administrators in India, Africa, and the Caribbean brought with them their ledgers, stamps, and sealing wax. They built small offices that mirrored Whitehall in miniature. In dusty colonial towns, you could hear the same familiar rhythm: pens scratching, pages turning, papers being folded into envelopes. The local populations often viewed these officials with confusion or amusement. To them, paperwork was an alien ritual, an endless act of writing that seemed disconnected from reality. But to the British, this ritual was sacred. To write something down was to make it law. A missionary in Kenya once recorded an exchange with a tribal elder who had just been told that his land now belonged to the crown. The elder asked, "Where is the land gone?" The administrator replied, "It is in the paper now." The elder nodded, "Then the paper is hungry." It was an observation both literal and prophetic. The paper did devour the world, its boundaries, its languages, its people. The empire was not merely mapped, it was paperized. The bureaucratic mind. By the dawn of the 20th century, bureaucracy was no longer merely a tool, it was an identity. To be British was to believe in forms, categories, and signatures. The empire's officials prided themselves on impartiality and rationality. They viewed themselves as servants of order, not of ideology. This mindset, sometimes called the Whitehall mentality, prized caution over creativity. Better to delay a decision than to make the wrong one. Better to write a new memorandum than to risk ambiguity. The result was a peculiar kind of stability. The British Empire endured not because it was just, but because it was administratively competent. It could absorb crisis, process rebellions, and regulate decay. Even as its colonies strained for independence, the paperwork continued, as if the empire existed purely through documentation. And perhaps in a way it did. For even as its territories shrank, the archives grew.